Thank you, Melanie, and thanks to the foundation for inviting me to speak today. It's really nice to be here. I've actually only been in Santa Fe since July of last year, so still learning the ropes, still learning this city, but it's a wonderful place, and it's really wonderful to see such engaged community in terms of questions about historic preservation and civics. So it's really nice to be here and to be with all of you. So let's see. Let's see. So just as a quick intro, social justice protests during the summer of 2020, arising from the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, increased awareness within the larger social conscience of problematic presence of public Confederate memorials across the South. Widespread vandalism of numerous monuments and historic sites arising from these protests renewed debates around continuing to fund the presence and maintenance of such monuments with public funds. This elevation of conservation and historic preservation to the level of national discourse also resulted in professional and personal introspection within the field of conservation. The primacy of conserving original materials by reversible means, regardless of the object, had historically assured a certain neutrality in treatment decisions and outcomes. However, limiting consideration of the full context of an object in this way and ignoring the significance of changes arising from the object's role as public sculpture were increasingly questioned as appropriate and sufficient in all cases. This talk will briefly introduce the profession of conservation, including the ethical and practical considerations that inform our treatment decisions. Vandalism related specifically to social justice protests in 2020 will demonstrate how the relatively young profession of art conservation continues to evaluate and evolve its ethical framework, how greater diversity within the field is critical to ensuring appropriate contextual considerations for treatments, and how the lessons learned from these cases can be applied to conservation and preservation approaches going forward. And then also, just as a disclaimer, all views expressed here are mine alone. I'm speaking as a conservator, and I don't represent the official positions or views of the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs. I also wanted to recognize that we are sitting on unceded ancestral Tewa land, which is now present-day Santa Fe. And also just a little bit more introduction to the topic. In preparing this and thinking about topics and thinking about and looking through images, there were a lot of pictures of people with hoses and brushes and power washers. And so I opted maybe not to go that route. There will be some images of that, but really this is more about contextualizing the environment that many of these monuments came into being, and also contextualizing the environment we are in now when we're trying to decide what our responsibility is to them as materials and what our responsibility is to them and to our community in which they are present. So, I'd like to talk about the difference between a few words that are sometimes used interchangeably, but for the purposes of this talk and within the field of conservation, I'd like to make some distinctions. The first is preservation. Preservation is the broadest term. It's maintaining in an existing state, preserving, conserving, and protecting buildings, objects, landscapes, or other artifacts of historic significance. It's a philosophical concept that became popular in Europe and America in the mid-19th century, alongside that of historic preservation. Conservation, as a subfield within preservation, relates to protecting cultural heritage for current and future generations. A conservator is a professional responsible for the preservation of artistic and cultural artifacts, known collectively as cultural heritage. Conservators possess an expertise to preserve cultural heritage in a way that retains the integrity of the object, building, or site, including its historical significance, context, aesthetic, or visual aspects. This kind of preservation is done by analyzing and assessing the condition of cultural property, understanding processes and evidence of deterioration, planning collections care or site management strategies that prevent damage, and carrying out conservation treatments and conducting research. A conservator's job is to ensure that objects are kept in the best possible condition. In the case of museum conservators, it is to serve a given collection's mission of bringing art to the public. So basically, simply put, our specialization is stuff, the materials. There can and frequently is, however, a lot of intangible content associated with these materials. To the extent materials embody conceptual or heritage-related content, that is part of our responsibility as well. Not all preservation is conservation. For example, in the case of documents, the legibility of a given object may be more important than the original document itself, in which case digital scans might be preferentially preserved in favor of original documents. Modern and contemporary art and the intentions of the artist are pushing the field of conservation to accept the role of refabrication or recreation as conservation. So just as an example, this is a work by the artist Felix Gonzalez Torres, and it's essentially a huge pile of candy. And the artist intends for this candy to be remade at each installation, and he intends fully for people to participate by eating the candy whenever that's part of the experience of the artwork. The artist Saul LeWitt created a body of wall drawings over the course of his career. The wall drawings are derived from a set of instructions created by the artist but never actually executed by him. Instead, the drawings are executed by a team. The artist wished that the drawings always looked new and intact. Therefore, they are regularly destroyed, painted over, and recreated as necessitated by fading or damage. Their preservation lies not in the maintenance of any of the original materials over time, but in the continuity of training those who execute them. In many ways, this concept of conservation has an even older precedent. Every 20 years, locals tear down the Ise-Jingu Grand Shrine in the Mie Prefecture of Japan, only to rebuild it anew. At any given time, there is one intact structure and one under construction. There is a forest dedicated to generating the wood for the project, and each iteration makes use of the best craftspeople of a given generation. They have been doing this for around 1,300 years. Some records indicate the Shinto shrine is up to 2,000 years old. This is Shinto's holiest and most important shrine, and the process of rebuilding the wooden structure every 20 years helped to preserve the original architect's design against the otherwise eroding effects of time. Its secret isn't heroic engineering or structural overkill, but rather cultural continuity. The third term I want to clarify is restoration. Restoration is returning something to a former condition. Sometimes restoration, or some level of restoration, is achieved through the course of a conservation treatment. For example, reassembling fragments of a broken mosaic or ceramic, mending a tear with a paper support, or securing the fibers around the edge of a textile. Returning clarity or completeness through the course of stabilizing is a combination of both conservation and restoration. However, part of our professional obligation is to balance the requirements for restoration separately from those of ensuring stability and respecting the original material and intent. These later issues are at the heart of a conservator's obligations. Restoration is not inherent in conservation and in fact can sometimes be counter to it, compromising or concealing original materials or meaning. The attempt to differentiate between conservation and restoration is central to the development of conservation as a distinct profession. While restoration can be an outcome of conservation, it is not itself necessarily conservation. And I just, as an illustrative point, wanted to talk about these two paintings by Barnett Newman. They're both in the collection of the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, and they both have very distinctive histories and relationships with vandalism. The first one is Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue, number 3. It's from 1968. And the lower one is Cathedra from 1951. These are small images that don't do justice to these really large paintings. They're each about 20 feet wide. And there's a subtlety and brushwork and intensity of color that completely envelops you when you're standing up in front of these paintings. In 1986, a Dutch citizen walked in with a Stanley knife and proceeded to attack Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue, cutting numerous large gashes throughout the surface of the work before he was stopped. The work was sent to a restorer and 3 years later came back to the Stedelijk. But when they looked at it, they began to notice that it looked different. And essentially what the restorer had done was he added an extra canvas on the back to reinforce the strength of the original canvas. But rather than just retouch the losses of the tears, he actually, with a paint roller, applied an entirely new red coat of paint over the entire red field of the painting. So I would say, for sure, restoration as opposed to conservation. 10 years later, after the same person got out of prison, got himself another Stanley knife, walked right back into the museum, and did the same thing to this painting, Cathedra by Barnett Newman. This time, however, the state was under the magnifying glass, especially given the fiasco of the previous restoration. And in this one, every attempt was made to be as careful as possible to preserve and not obscure any original material. So the tears were mended thread by thread, and then rather than locally overpainting the whole painting, only the areas along the slash were actually retouched, and you can see the conservators there working carefully with lots of blue pigment to achieve the result. As I mentioned earlier, the distinction between restorer and conservator was at the crux of our professionalization. It's precisely this particular thinking about the inviolability of original material that continues to evolve with our profession and has been under close scrutiny as the social events between 2015 and 2020 caused us to reevaluate the limits of our commitments to original cultural heritage material in every case. I'll now briefly discuss the history of the field of conservation, with some of the main themes being our necessity over time to increasingly collaborate outside museum walls with heritage stakeholders and the community in order to most completely fulfill our ethical obligations to objects. The 19th century witnessed a growing collaboration between the fields of art and science. The years between 1925 and 1975 in the United States marked a period of pioneering progress and expansion in the field. A special climate of cooperation among scientists, art historians, and restorers developed at the Fogg Art Museum at Harvard University in the late 1920s. For example, X-rays had been discovered in 1895, and paintings were first X-rayed within a year of that discovery. Major professional societies and training programs also appeared between 1925 and 1975. The American group of the IIC, or the International Institute for Conservation, began in 1960 and became the American Institute for Conservation, AIC, which you'll see throughout this talk, in 1973, publishing a journal and newsletter and convening annual meetings. The flooding of the Arno River in Florence in 1996 and the mobilization of conservators from Europe and America to deal with the cultural heritage aftermath in Florence brought an increased standardization to treatment procedures and added notoriety to the field. The AIC has now about 3,000 members, includes 860 fellows and professional associates. This is a peer-approved status that requires us to uphold the Code of Ethics. Conservation training evolved from apprenticeship to formal education and training programs, the first appearing in New York in 1960. Two other U.S. art conservation programs opened in 70 and 74, with the fourth program dedicated to archaeological materials opening in 2003. There are about 40 conservators graduate each year in the U.S. and make their way out into the world. Worldwide, there are approximately 50 programs in 30 countries in conservation and another 50 in archaeological materials, books, decorative arts, and musical instruments. Initially, material specialization was rare. There are now 9 specialty groups, including architecture, book and paper, electronic media, objects, paintings, photographic materials, textiles, and wooden artifacts. A minimally interventive philosophy has now been adopted by most conservators, especially as we revisit our own treatments from 25 years ago, and as we watch our materials, along with ourselves and our attitudes, age. We've become more aware of respecting and retaining age value, historical value, and commemorative value. Since the 1980s, conservators have increasingly collaborated with living artists, and the importance of interviewing artists to ascertain their views about materials and damages has become a fundamental documentation tool. And as Melanie alluded to, at the Menil in Houston, where I worked previously, we had an ongoing research program where we interviewed living artists and then shared those online. Consulting and working with living artists or collaborating with Native Americans has been categorized together as acknowledging the culture of origin, which is yet another important new direction for conservation. The recognition of cultural relativism and contested meanings embedded within material objects began entering the conservation literature in the 1980s and is now commonplace. As I mentioned earlier, the American Institute for Conservation was established in 1973 as an independent organization with the intent to coordinate and improve professional standards of training and the needs to protect and preserve cultural materials of all kinds. Its code of ethics and standard of practice were developed in 1967. While initially restricted to art, the professional standards were eventually deemed applicable to the full range of cultural materials, fine and applied arts, archaeological, ethnographic, and archival materials, as well as natural history specimens. While not a complete list, I wanted to share some of the current ethical stances relevant in my talk today. So those are just generally, again, working with an informed respect for the cultural property, its unique character and significance, and the people or person who created it. We recognize the right of society to make appropriate and respectful use of cultural property. The conservation professional, however, shall serve as an advocate for the preservation of the property itself. And as conservators, we should only recommend or undertake treatments that are judged suitable to the preservation of the aesthetic, conceptual, and physical characteristics of the cultural property. And any time we need to intervene or restore, such compensations should be reversible and should not falsely modify the known aesthetic, conceptual, and physical characteristics of the cultural property, especially by removing or obscuring original material. So perhaps you can see where I'm going with this, with the upcoming topic. This was our code of ethics going into, I believe this last version was ratified in maybe 2012. So anyway, as you can understand, this was there was a need for us to revisit the appropriateness of this particular code or its applicability to certain situations. Let's see. I'd like to now apply these ethical obligations for informed respect and advocacy for the preservation of cultural property directly to the case of Confederate monuments in the southern United States. My hope is to examine how these ethical requirements are based in an earlier and I would say naive belief in the capacity of scientific objectiveness in our field, how objective advocacy for cultural materials of any kind can be problematic. Again, we specialize in stuff and we have to deal with stuff, and the hard part is stuff. We cannot treat it with an incomplete context. It cannot be considered without its conceptual and heritage components. One of the main arguments lodged against the refusal to restore and perpetuate monuments to the Confederacy is that history is being erased. However, close inspection of when and how the majority of these monuments came into being reveals that it is the monuments themselves that are proposing some level of erasure. The memorialization of the Confederacy contradicts the wishes of both its president and commander of the Army. And again, just some quick quotes from Robert E. Lee. I think it wisest not to keep open the sores of war, but to follow the example of those nations who endeavored to obliterate the marks of civil strife and to commit to oblivion the feelings it engendered. And then Jefferson Davis, my pride is that the flag shall not set between contending brothers, and that when it shall no longer be the common flag of the country, it shall be folded up, laid away like a vesture no longer used. This is a really interesting timeline developed by the Southern Poverty Law Center to demonstrate the coincidence of the establishment of Confederate memorials relative to the Civil War itself, as well as to the enactment of Jim Crow laws, those laws that are enacted to disenfranchise blacks, and civil rights legislation. It's quite a detailed map, and unfortunately it's necessarily small here. I did blow up it just a little bit because I want to draw your attention to a couple of areas where we see, I think, the most activity in terms of the enactment of memorials. This also takes into account the naming of schools, streets, and other things like that to members of the Confederacy. So here you see early in the 1900s, the turn of the century, as Jim Crow laws intending to enforce segregation were being enacted. And then again here, in the 1950s as civil rights legislation was being proposed and enacted. The monuments were a deliberate attempt, let me just make sure I'm right, deliberate attempt of organizations like the Daughters of the Confederacy, the Sons of Confederate War Veterans, and even the Ku Klux Klan to promote an incomplete account of the Civil War that buttressed white supremacist ideology and ignored the legacy of slavery. As part of our ethical responsibility, these cultural motivations must be acknowledged alongside those of any artistic intent. And while I'm on that idea of artistic intent, I wanted to add an additional point, which is that in many cases, the artist or manufacturer of a given Confederate monument is not stated. However, the names of the people involved in the funding raising are, the amount raised, and the documentation of the dedication ceremony always are. So to me, this indicates the act of commissioning and dedicating a monument was significantly more important than the facts of its creation or any interest in artistic merit. I'd now like to consider iconoclastic movements and their legacy in the preservation of cultural heritage. There are three results from iconoclasm. It can be an irreversible process with permanent loss. There can be reversible loss, or the effects can be retained as evidence of history. Some of the most notable regime changes of modern history have been nurtured and legitimized through iconoclastic protest. The French Revolution and the fall of the Soviet Union display two of the most socially legitimized iconoclastic protests of the past 3 centuries. Both instances arose out of citizen unrest rather than top-down legislative politics, displaying the widespread intention of initiation of revolution through symbolic acts of destruction. Iconoclasm may be described as the act of defacing culturally salient religious or political symbols to delegitimize the moral authority behind such symbols. While iconoclastic methods range from flag burning to the destruction of entire religious spaces, these practices display a common ethos rooted in the disruption of culturally hegemonic moral principles. It is important to note that the nature of the current iconoclastic movement in the U.S. is related to symbols of the state, and therefore, to analyze this movement against broader historical patterns, we must look at state iconoclasm in particular. During the French Revolution, the Bastille prison and military base, a symbol of the Ancien Regime political control, was stormed and later dismantled by French citizens. Statues depicting Henry IV, Louis XIII, XIV, and XV were all destroyed throughout the country following the initial defacement of the Bastille prison. This one here is actually a 12th century depiction of King David that was beheaded in the course of iconoclasm during the French Revolution simply because it represented the monarchy. The official dissolution of the USSR did not officially occur until 1991. However, the eventual regime change followed 2 years later This eventual regime change followed 2 years of Soviet degradation sparked by a single act of iconoclasm. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall, which symbolized the global division between communist institutional life and Western capitalism, was demolished by citizens of both East and West Germany. And then just here, it's a small image, but despite the value of its underlying real estate, a small section of the wall was retained by the state as a memorial to the wall and its disastrous effects on German citizens on both sides. Nearly 130 years ago, Black people in South Carolina risked their lives to intervene in the politics of public memory. In the 1890s, Mamie Garvin Fields, a young black girl in Charleston, each day she passed the monument to pro-slavery advocate John C. Calhoun. Mamie knew what the only historical record can tell us today, that the black community in Charleston would regularly assault the statue, chipping away at it, scratching it, even shooting at it to leave their mark. The destruction was so effective that within 4 years, white authorities remade the monument and lifted the statue 115 feet into the air. It's historically incorrect to criticize the actions of current protesters as occurring in isolation and without precedent. Objections to these monuments are not simply in the moment. They are the latest in a history of attempts to remove these monuments and what they may symbolize. Iconoclasm results until change is made. As Martin Luther King Jr. cried during the Civil Rights Movement, riots are the cries of the unheard. Iconoclasm displays how heinous offenses to human rights can only be internalized by the masses for so long. In considering the ultimate fate of Confederate monuments when they are vandalized and or taken off view, it's being proposed that their legacy is better preserved within a museum, where the context can be provided and their siting does not require daily engagement with the public. While in some cases I would argue that this is correct, museums, particularly art museums, do not have a great track record in displaying cultural heritage with sensitivity to its communities of origin. This is the Michael C. Rockefeller wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where heritage of 3 distinctly different cultures, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Pacific Islands, and North, Central, and South America, are all displayed together for their classification as tribal primitive other. I should also note that this installation has been taken down and it's currently under renovation and it's expected to open in 2025, with each of the different groups represented having their own section within the gallery. Part of the issue is also the demographics of conservators and allied professionals. There's minimal representation beyond whites in a majority of cultural heritage sectors. Historical issues that have created this situation, I think we'll all recognize, but in the field of conservation, the requirement of pre-program internships, that is experience gained prior to applying to the graduate programs, have historically been unpaid, leaving them only as an option for only a select few. The earning potential of these careers, as well as the historic disenfranchisement that discourages undergraduate and graduate education in minority populations in general, is also to be blamed. And as a field, we are really taking this issue to heart and trying to expand the pipeline through which there can be much greater representation in the field of conservation. Edward Colston was a British merchant and transatlantic slave trader. A bronze statue of him was created in 1875 by an artist named John Cassidy, and it was sited on a concrete pedestal in a public park in Bristol, England. As part of the worldwide Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, the sculpture was toppled and eventually dumped into the Bristol harbor. The sculpture was eventually retrieved by the city, desalinated, that is, washed to prevent the salt water from accelerating corrosion, and it was put on view in a municipal museum. The curatorial decision was made to retain the vandalism and display the statue horizontally at ground level. While the above case study demonstrates the potential of one approach, museums must question the very definition of conservation for such cultural heritage. Can conservation create alternative guidelines for defaced or dethroned monuments that do not call for them to be preserved as originally created? Perhaps that's precisely what the Black iconoclastic tradition encourages us to reconsider. In asking to value Black life and history, we must challenge museums, our elected officials, and communities to revisit the political implications of care, memory, community, decision-making, and perhaps the productive role of destruction. As a profession, are we willing to accept the maintenance of graffiti and other evidence of socially legitimized iconoclasm? I would propose that there already is a precedent, that we have already been accepting it, both historically and in contemporary. We just need to begin applying these lessons more actively and consciously. So in 2017, my professional organization, the AIC, made a statement that it revised again in 2020, with the one in 2017 being more specific about the ethical considerations related specifically to this cultural heritage, and again in 2020 stating it, I would say, even more emphatically. And so I just wanted to go through these briefly just so you can see in relation to what I showed you earlier where we are as a profession standing. Decisions about the preservation of contested monuments must include and prioritize the views of those subjected to their never-ending visual and psychological abuse. It's imperative that anyone involved in the decision-making about contested monuments consider the history and context of the work in question and encourage, if not insist upon, the inclusion of stakeholder communities. Conservation professionals have a responsibility to design a course of treatment in keeping with community consensus and according to best conservation practices. The preservation of a monument may include preserving damage, such as vandalism, done in the name of social justice, since historical precedent indicates that defacement often becomes a part of the meaning of the work. And this one I think is critical too. Although artistic value is a factor in commemorative and Confederate monumental public art, in the case of contested monuments, it cannot supersede the importance of social justice. In closing, and it's going to take me a little while to wrap up, I'd like to revisit the case for the conservation of Confederate monuments within a more global context for memorializing horrific histories. Germany has no monuments that celebrate the Nazi armed forces, however many grandfathers fought or fell for them. Instead, it has a dizzying number and variety of monuments to the victims of its murderous racism. There are no Nazi sites in Germany in the sense that there are plantation sites in the United States. The only equivalent site that now exists in Germany are the concentration camps. On the site of Buchenwald, where as many as 250,000 inmates were held, a museum dispels any notion that the citizens of the nearby cultural capital Weimar were unaware of what was happening in their midst during the Second World War. The idea that tourists would visit such a place seeking smiling women in dirndls, much as some visit American plantations looking for ladies in hoop skirts, is obscene. Not even members of Germany's right-wing Alternative to Germany party would suggest glorifying that particular past. Italy has reckoned differently with its fascist past and its monuments. By the public at large, they are currently seen as part of the Italian heritage. There are ancient Roman monuments, there are Renaissance monuments, there are Baroque palaces, and there's also the heritage of fascism. In much the same way that the monuments of the Confederacy perpetuate a selective narrative at the expense of slavery, in Italy the message continues to be that fascism brought about modernity, hiding the dictatorship, the persecutions, the discriminations, and the war. In particular, the building, seen here, was once designed by Mussolini to cast his regime in the lineage of the Romans, with allusions to the Colosseum. The global fashion house Fendi is the current owner. In the statue on the right, the original boy giving a fascist salute has been softened with the addition of some boxing gloves. In some ways, this commingling and acceptance by many reflects our situation here. Italian fascism has been smoothly integrated into the Italian present. Reconciliation in the face of the Cold War was deemed more important by the American and British than eradicating the visual fascist legacy. I also wanted to include an example of a historically difficult site memorialized but also reclaimed in an attempt to move forward. And this is the Estadio Nacional Julio Martinez Perados. It's outside Santiago, Chile. After the coup d'etat of September 11th, 1973, that ousted President Salvador Allende, the stadium began to be used as a detention facility. Over 40,000 people spent time in the compound during the junta regime. 12,000 detainees were interred between September 11th and November 7th of 1973. In 2011, Chile renovated the stadium and set aside a section of the stadium, which you can see here, rows of old wooden bleachers called Azotea 8, in order to honor the prisoners who were detained and died there. It is surrounded by a barbed wire fence within what is otherwise an actively used football stadium. The larger questions for our field specifically, but also for our country in general, is: are we willing to commit to letting some material culture disappear? It's already happening, as it has over the course of human history. We are simply closer to this instance in time, and the question is whether to have it happen by active decision rather than by passive neglect. What is not in question is the need for inclusive decision-making and researching the totality of what some cultural heritage represents, rather than simply accepting what it purports to represent. As one approach for myself, I'm interested in a movement towards memorialized place over object, towards history over monument, and towards idea over material. And this is just a really interesting quote. These monuments are put up to revere these figures, and if we say we want a non-racist society, of course, we have to get rid of them. In particular, this quote, though, statues are not about history. Statues are about a certain version of history. In some ways, complete obliteration of all aspects of a monument reinforces a given moment without a glance at what happened either before or after it. This argument has been made for retaining the German concentration camps in isolation as the only reference to the Nazi regime. We still know too little about how Germany reached the point of committing the crimes of the Holocaust. In absence, we may lose the opportunity to learn anything useful. Perhaps leaving empty pedestals within their original settings allows for the representation of history of such monuments through time, a more inclusive representation of history, preserving the evidence of change rather than stasis. This more complete representative history is how many historic southern plantation sites are now beginning to operate. There is an increasing focus on what happened outside the plantation home. There is a fuller accounting of the objects. Both the shackles for the slave quarters and the silver and settees of the main house are on view and contextualized. Right now, as conservation professionals, we are committed at some level to the objects themselves. However, just as conservation is a young field, we are a young nation and need to be looking at longer-term precedents. We need to engage in collaborations with a wide range of communities of origin. We need to look deeper into our emphasis on material culture over oral history. We need to be taking advantage of our proximity to this moment to document all of the above. I personally feel very strongly about the following. Not everyone seeking to preserve symbols of the Confederacy is a racist, but the racist embrace of the Confederacy makes plain. Anyone who fights for those symbols is fighting for racist values. For monuments are neither just about heritage or just about hate. They are values made visible. That's why we build memorials to some parts of history and ignore others. They embody the ideas we choose to lift up in the hopes of reminding ourselves and our children that those ideas have been embodied by brave women and men. Where there is controversy, we need to choose history over memorializing. There should not be one solution in every situation. Material culture is finite. After 1,000 years, ultimately, it will be the ideas rather than the artifacts that are perpetuated. Is the act of perpetuating monuments to slavery going to be the legacy we perpetuate over generations? Or, like the Issei Shrine, is it going to be our willingness to let go of the tangible, of representations of the worst in ourselves and our culture, and have our willingness to release what needs to decay be the legacy we perpetuate across the centuries? Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. We'll do a few questions.
Just a few.
Well, Elizabeth, we might have to monitor how many you get. Anyone want to start?
So, Brad, I have a question. So, I understand that conservators have a role to play in this process, but frequently it seems to me that people making the decisions on whether these monuments stay or go or are adapted are as much political as they are the purview of a museum professional. So how does your profession kind of reconcile that or deal with that?
Mm-hmm.
And can you get ahead of that curve?
I think it's hard to get ahead of that curve, and I think it's also hard to sometimes get a seat at the table. I think there are communities where there is a committee or other representative body that contains representatives from the cultural heritage sector. Some of those are conservators, but it's the exception and it's not the rule. I think it's really important that, and this is in some ways why I felt compelled to give this talk, is that for those of us that have perhaps some sphere of influence, that we can begin to maybe introduce these ideas and these concepts as part of the discussion, because again, it's only through these very inclusive conversations that the best results are going to be achieved.
Thank you.
Now, at one point in your slides, you talk about removing monuments that constituted visual and psychological abuse to the population nearby. Well, who decides that? I mean,
No, I think
I'm
that's...
in favor of many things that you're talking about, but who's the decision maker? Is it a small mob? Is it, elevated to a higher level? Who makes the decision?
I think at some point it has to be a holistic decision about what the intent of that particular thing, that monument was. If its original intent was in fact intimidation or discouragement, I think then that can be extrapolated to a smaller group of people. I mean, you have to consider the full picture of any given monument. I do think that with the new criteria in the ethics, where it becomes more specific and we begin to specialize, that it can become a slippery slope philosophically about who does make that decision, what offense is significant enough. But again, I think, I think we're still learning what the criteria are. I think as long as we are continuing to see what the original intent of those monuments were, and if they were intimidation, if they were about coercing a particular group, then I think we have to listen to the people that are saying they're being affected by that. Yes?
One word that you mentioned and one word that you didn't mention come to mind. One is consensus. You mentioned that about a third of the way through, and you set that up very rapidly as part of an ideal way of coming to a solution. Now that's a very tricky thing, especially for a country such as ours that has been dominated by a lot of Puritanism, which isn't exactly. So we have a lot of work there in consensus. And yesterday I was talking with my 19-year-old granddaughter, who is not a flaming rebel, but is an independent thinker. And we were talking about juxtaposition. So that's the word I would use along with consensus to consider how we would approach looking at this whole thing. I like a lot of what you're saying, where we're trying to figure out what was the original intent. And the word original is tricky for us here in Santa Fe. What was the original monument? And when we refer to it, original when? But those things can be cleared up, I believe. And I think they should be before we make a decision. The business of my granddaughter and I were talking about the importance of juxtaposition. It's much more interesting to have more than one thing to consider, especially when there's disagreement. And I remember as a Unitarian going to my Sunday school and getting, when I graduated, a Bible with a picture of Jesus with blonde hair and blue eyes. And I remember thinking, well, gosh, that's kind of interesting. I thought he was from another part of the world. So it's more fun to know about our mistakes in order to get past them. How to build consensus is a really tricky thing. We've tried it here, I think, in Santa Fe. For some people it's worked pretty well, for others it has not worked. That doesn't mean it's not a work in progress. And last thing I would point out is Tim Maxwell reminded me about an article he read, and he wrote a quick thing in the Old Santa Fe Association newsletter about the Pettis Bridge, and that more than half of the black folks in that town wanted to keep the name. They said, we want to be able to walk under that name that we hate so that we can refer to it. And what Germany has done is very different from what we might be doing. I just love that it's a big mess right now. It's really,
Uh,
really interesting.
It is a big mess. Yeah, yeah. And one point about consensus is I also think it's important to remember that by and large these monuments were not put up in consensus. There was a particular and so it's really hard to now be in the position of advocating for consensus when consensus isn't what got us here in the first place. So I think that also makes it a very difficult mess too. Yeah. But I also think there are more complicated instances and there are more straightforward instances. And if we can agree on the more straightforward instances, why not make some progress on those, and perhaps solutions will follow. And I think the other thing is we also, again, I allude to it, we have to give ourselves time. This is a 150-year-old discussion, but at the same time, it's really not quite 150 years old. It's more like 100, maybe 80 years old. I think we need to be willing to give ourselves space to live without these things. Again, if somebody had the opportunity to erect it in the first place, perhaps somebody else needs the opportunity to not live with it for a time. And we have, this collective reconciliation in a way of what that ultimately means and what the best way forward is, and not force our hand to make a decision so quickly.
Boy, I agree with that.
Is there ever a situation where a monument should be destroyed, completely destroyed, no more?
Do you want my professional opinion or my personal opinion, or both? Well, I actually think it's really interesting. A case in point, when Charlottesville took down a huge monumental statue of, one was Robert E. Lee and the other one was Stonewall Jackson, they actually put them up kind of for sale, so to speak. And they basically got 4 people or 4 groups that were interested in buying them or taking them on. And one of them was actually a think tank, and their proposal was actually to melt it down and rebuild something else out of it. And the other person that got one of the other statues, their proposal was to include it in an upcoming exhibition of Black contemporary art. So I think these questions are out there, and again, they're actually happening. And again, the destruction of monuments happen all the time inadvertently, natural disasters, etc. And we accept them. Again, they're not occurring as willfully as maybe taking things down. But again, we need to see the big picture of what we are actually used to and accept, and what we are seeing as different that is not necessarily different.
Well, I think Adam had one next.
Yeah.
Very interesting. And I don't know if I have a full question, but I was interested when you said, when you mentioned the slippery slope. Everyone in this room is thinking about the Soldiers' Monument, the obelisk on the plaza, and trying to apply the very thoughtful criteria that you have, shown for us today. It seems to me that there are, and with regard to slippery slope, when something like the Code of Ethics includes a term like settler colonialism, which in the sort of discourse in all academic fields arose in the last 30 years, didn't exist before then, and certainly didn't exist in the 70s when a guy came to the monument on the plaza and chiseled out the word savage, which is a different act of iconoclasm that in some ways I think, I know just from growing up in Santa Fe, my friends thought that was a really cool act that was super interesting, and that sort of had resolved some of the tensions for us. I'm a white person, not an indigenous person, so I can see a different perspective on it as well. And I think that it's almost that the education and awareness and conversations around something like the Soldiers' Monument and a term like settler colonialism, where people come and settle and thereby colonize the sort of people around them, i.e. the Tewa pueblos. It does something interesting to to how people view the object. And so what was once benign and unquestioned, even while Pueblo and Navajo people sat underneath the Palace of the Governors for 60, 70 years, it changed the situation all of a sudden. And I think that it is just very interesting. I feel agnostic about the obelisk, but there are some slippery slopes that also are troublesome to me. That I think will force more difficult conversations in our future.
Mhm.
So I think this is a super important food for thought, though.
My question is, to understand what the intent of a monument is, how do you feel about adding to it? And also, we have technology now, like, for example, the Soldiers Monument, those little cube things that there actually could be explanations from other people, view the Taiwan, whatever, that
Mhm.
could explain how they feel about it. And so in that sense, it would enlarge the perspective that we've been.
I think that's a big part of the discussion about how to resolve the monuments is there context that we can put up that can explain, why these are here, where they came from, what they arose from, why people are upset and have been upset about them for decades. I think there is a place for that. I also think it's really interesting that people where a monument would never dawn on them as a way to memorialize or consider something now have to put themselves in that position of thinking about what it is about it that offends them or doesn't offend them. It's like it's a form that maybe nobody ever really thought about until now suddenly we all are thinking about it and reading about it all the time. And I think that's, especially in a place like Santa Fe where there's so many different modes of memory and communication, to think of, this kind of foisted on mode of representation, now everybody's having to think in terms of this one fixed kind of idea. I think that's, while it's so difficult, it's also, I think, an interesting, and maybe if there's a silver lining, there's a interesting conceptual thoughts that can come out of thinking about it.
So I think we might have maybe 2 more questions, but yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Well, yeah, we've kind of landed where we expected to land. It's back in Santa Fe. But you've been around quite a bit, and you've seen other communities deal with some of the issues that we're dealing with here. And I'm wondering if you, in observing how other communities have behaved and come to some kind of a resolution or consensus, have you seen that, and do you think any of the ideas that you have seen other people implement would be successful with the way forward for our community?
Mm-hmm. I don't know, because this is a particularly unique community. I mean, I suppose they all are, but I think, to my mind at least, the most successful solutions are the one that do not purport to be a final solution, right? They are accepting that this is a solution for the time being. So we take them off you, we put them in an undisclosed location. We don't have a long-term plan for storing this, but the immediate problem is removed and it gives us some breathing room over the next number of years. I think it's finding a way, some mode of representing what was there, whether it's leaving it as it was broken, whether it's totally removing it. I think we need to, I think maybe we can come to consensus on that idea, and also on maybe some limited time frame. And again, not expecting us to come to consensus in a year or 2 years, but we have to just think much more long term over this. And I also think, I alluded to it a little bit, I think we also need to be thinking beyond like finite monuments and material. I mean, how wonderful is that plaza? What it represents in and of itself without a monument in the middle. You have the Native Americans in the palace over, you just have all of these different more abstract representations of what this community actually is without forcing it into a, kind of very conventional kind of mode like an obelisk with written plaques. So I think we also need to think about how we memorialize. And I think we probably all know in our head, we haven't really ever seen that many successful memorials necessarily. I mean, I think the few that really are successful all come to mind relatively quickly, and the rest, I mean, despite being memorials, are pretty unmemorable. So I would say that we need to start thinking more broadly about how we represent ourselves in what we feel we need to memorialize as a community.
And we'll do one more if anyone has one, and then of course the prize will just stick around for a little
Sure.
while. You could ask some questions. Does anyone have one last question? Better be a good one.